Hello, and welcome to our weekly dialogue with Helga Zepp May. She is the founder and chairwoman of the Schiller Institute. Today is May 15th, 2024, and I'm Harley Schlanger. I will be your host. You can send us your questions and comments via email to questions@schillerinstitute.org or post them on the chat page. Now, Helga, there are many developments on the transatlantic NATO war front that we'll be discussing today, but I'd like to begin with your thoughts on the meeting that will start tomorrow when President Putin of Russia goes to China to visit his counterpart, President Xi Jinping of China. It appears that you were right when you reported about 2 weeks ago that you didn't think the efforts of Blinken and others to disrupt the relationship between Russia and China would work, and that the attempt to break the alliance would fail. What are your expectations for this meeting that starts tomorrow?
Well, I think it will be another major step in actually building the relationship between China and Russia more deeply, because Putin is going there on a state visit, and he takes with him several members of his rebuilt cabinet, the new defense minister, but also Shoigu will be there, but also Lavrov and a business delegation. So I expect that, the preparation will be discussed for the upcoming BRICS summit this year, later in October, because Russia has the chairmanship this year. And as Foreign Minister Lavrov said recently, the role of Russia in the BRICS is to basically expand the relations among the new countries, and interestingly, he names Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and the Emirates and Saudi Arabia. This was not so clear the whole time. And he said they will discuss the, nomination and acceptance of new members, which he has not yet named which ones these will be. So I think, therefore, this meeting will be a stepping stone, because it's even the Western media, like The Economist, are full of stories that the old order is dying, that it's disintegrating. And obviously, the emergence of the BRICS as a viable new institution, actually open for everybody. If the Western and US leadership would not be so in love with themselves and arrogant, they would take the offer of both Xi Jinping and also Putin. Recently said he is still absolutely open for dialogue with the West, however, on an equal footing and eye to eye, and not in an arrogant way looking down. If the West would be smart, they would just say, look, there is a new reality emerging. It is in our best interest to cooperate. But I don't expect this to happen in the short term. Maybe they need a couple of more shocks to really realize that their system is not functioning. So I think this meeting will be very, very important. And, since we are going into a half year of tectonic, dramatic changes, where the world by the end of this half year will not look at all like it is looking now. What I mean by that, we are seeing the massive march forward by Russia on the Ukrainian battlefield. There is panic in Kiev. Even CNN reported that, the losses of the Ukrainian, especially in the last days, were incredibly. I think Russia moved forward 100 kilometers in 3 days. And, basically several experts and analysts, such as Larry Johnson, basically say, this is finished, and NATO could not even realistically move troops into Ukraine. I mean, he was sort of ridiculizing it by saying that, the NATO, what would you do? How would you get the troops there? They would be shot on the spot, as the Russians have said they would. There would be no logistical backup for them. He said, look at the situation. Russia is producing 3 times as many artillery pieces than the United States and Europe together. Russia is building in 1 month as many tanks as Europe and the United States together are building in 1 year. So it is very obvious that the military war is won by the Russians. And there are also Chinese comments on the appointment of the new defense minister of Russia, Belousov, that he is the basic mind behind the incredible Russian economic successes, who was withstanding sanctions from the West. Germany is collapsing, Russia is moving upward. Russia is now the 5th largest economy in the world. But that the appointment of this economic specialist, who has an excellent reputation, means that, basically Russia is preparing itself, if need be, to be in the Ukrainian military situation for a long time. That's the Chinese view of the matter expressed in Global Times. So I think, the Ukraine thing will probably end soon. Then we will have the worsening financial crisis in the West, where also, lots of articles are being written about. Then we will have the BRICS summit in October. All of this will happen before the US election. So I think that the landscape strategically will change extremely dramatically, and most people have not woken up in the West that these changes are taking place. So I'm absolutely sure that, given that it was announced that Xi Jinping and Putin will discuss the entire scope of strategic issues, I think all of these things will be on their discussion agenda, and I expect some significant statement to come out afterwards.
Okay, you're listening to Helga Zepp May. You can send us your questions or comments at questions@schillerinstitute.org. Now, Helga, on this, we have a question from the United Kingdom. He writes, there's speculation in the Western media about the shakeup in Russia, the so-called shakeup of the defense team. What do you think is going on?
Well, in part, I touched upon it already in what I said, that from everything which we can know about it at this point, is that this new defense minister is an excellent dirigistic-oriented economist, or he has helped to get the Russian economy out of the bombardment with the sanctions. And, he is going to try to streamline the military part of the economy with the civilian part of the economy, so that the civilian economy can prosper despite whatever military things have to be taken care of. And I think that, in a certain sense, the sanctions, there's even one view which says that the sanctions actually helped Russia, because it forced it to decolonize by, getting rid of dependencies of Western, influence. And that, I think, includes increasingly also the financial sector, even if there is still, remnants of the old ways of, doing things as they were introduced in the immediate post-Soviet period by Yeltsin. But that is being cleaned out as well. So I think that the situation in Russia looks quite stable. I think the society, by being attacked by the West the way it has been now for several years, not only militarily in Ukraine, but naturally the entire demonization of Russia and the entire sanctions regime and all of this. I think it has led to a change inside Russia, whereby, let's say, getting rid of Western influences in terms of postmodern culture and various other influences which have been rejected. This has helped Russia to find back more to its traditional culture, to traditional poetry, to traditional values. And I think Russia is, in a Russian way, doing exactly what China did. When basically China was rising, they did not adopt the Western model, but they went back to Chinese values. So some people may lament about that, but actually, from the standpoint of universal history, it's probably the best thing which could happen, that each culture reactivates its own best tradition. And the only people who are not doing that are the West. We are not celebrating the 200th birthday of the premiere of the Ninth Symphony of Beethoven, which would have uplifted us a lot if we would have done it. It was done here and there by, I think, Barenboim and some other people. But I think that the West should do the same thing. We should revive our best traditions, and then we could live in a peaceful cooperation instead of this geopolitical insanity which is gripping the minds of the Western establishments right now.
Okay, Helga, I have a question from a journalist from Lebanon who writes, with all the back and forth over Biden's decision to pause some weapons shipments to Israel, the weapons pipeline still remains open, even as Netanyahu flaunts his non-compliance with Biden's red line regarding Rafah. He asks, do you think Biden will back off from a further confrontation with Netanyahu? And what could he do?
Well, I think, whatever Biden does is not Biden. Obviously, he is not always fully there. And I think it's much more the entire apparatus of the Mickey Met, what Mary McGowan calls Mickey Mac, which is, the military industrial complex, plus think tanks, media, congressional, academia, and so forth. This complex. I think this policy will continue unless the protest, which now has not only spread throughout more than 100 American universities, but into Europe, into Italy. There are many universities in Italy, in France, even in Germany. It's spreading. I think that student movement, which is really, it's not just the issue of Gaza, which naturally is what really gets people extremely upset, but it is a slow recognition that the entire narrative of the Western model is a narrative. It's not the truth. And I think there is an awakening among the young people of America and hopefully also in Europe. You can see clearly signs of that as well. And that will be a factor Biden has to watch, because, that was a grouping which contributed to a very significant extent to his election victory in 2021. And if these voters turn away from Biden, he probably will lose the election. So that's a big factor in the situation. I think that the policy towards Netanyahu, what he could do, is to go with the Oasis plan. I mean, we have presented a very, very reasonable and feasible proposal how to get peace in Southwest Asia on a permanent basis. The Oasis plan is, the idea to green the desert, to produce large quantities of fresh water, And, with the help of peaceful nuclear energy, desalination, building canals, building actually new rivers, irrigate agriculture, reforest the desert. Actually, if you have a vision that the Southwest Asia could look like in 30 years like Germany, in terms of the density of infrastructure, having an integrated infrastructure system, build new cities. There are major development corridors already in various degrees of being built, all parts of the Belt and Road Initiative, but it could become really an international project. And the United States and Europe, they should stop playing geopolitical games and imitating the great game of the British and start to actually cooperate to really build up the region and overcome tension by joint economic development. We have presented this program. You can go on our website looking at April 13th. We had a very excellent conference. We had a follow-up conference in Copenhagen a few weeks later. And the Oasis Plan idea is circulating right now among governments, among many important institutions. And, it is something which could be put on the agenda immediately, and it would immediately change the dynamic, because once you give a perspective of hope for the future, that is the basis for a peaceful settlement in the region. So that is the challenge.
Now, you mentioned the student protests and what's coming out of that. There's a contact from Canada who wrote in and said, while I'm excited to see student protests in the United States against Israel's attacks on Palestine and civilian population and protesting U.S. support for Israel, I worry that these youth are susceptible to being used, like the Black Lives Matter movement, to polarize further the U.S. What are your thoughts on how this can be a positive movement?
Well, the United States is already polarized. If you talk to some people who are Democrats about Trump and vice versa, you're already talking to two completely different worldviews, and there is no middle ground among them. Don't be afraid of polarization. From a historical standpoint, I think the United States, which started off as a republic, which started off as the beacon of hope and temple of liberty for every Republican-minded person around the globe, this was continued, by presidents like John Quincy Adams, Lincoln, and you had a recurrence of that with Franklin D. Roosevelt and Kennedy. And, the problem is that the United States has lost its way. They have deviated from the idea of being a republic, and because of evil shenanigans, they have adopted the British Empire model as the way to run the world on an unipolar world order based on this special relationship between the Anglo-Americans. And that order is not functioning. That is exactly the backlash, the blowback, which we see right now with the Global South, that, all the policies which were promoted by this effort to keep an unipolar world after the Soviet Union had disappeared or disintegrated, that just did not work. And that policy has triggered and caused all of the things we are seeing now around, the globe, both in terms of tensions and wars, but also in terms of the BRICS, because the BRICS is, in a certain sense, the reaction to that significant countries do not want to be, under the control of a world policeman. Xi Jinping at one point said, if India and China speak with one voice, the world is listening, because they represent together around 3 billion people. And, the BRICS is now becoming much larger and the global majority. the global south represent 88% of the world, and they don't want to be ruled by an unipolar world. So I think the more quickly there is a realization that the United States should really go back to its old tradition of being a republic and accept the foreign policy conception of John Quincy Adams to be in an alliance of perfectly sovereign nation states, and just be one of many, not be the only one or the chosen people or the necessary country, or all of these things which are really feeding a wrong self-conception. If the United States would think to go back to be a republic, to be for the common good, not only of its own people, but in cooperation with other people, the world could be straightened out very quickly. And I think the students are contributing a very important part to get the United States back on its correct way.
Here's a question that I think was meant somewhat sarcastically, referring to Netanyahu and Biden and everyone else referring to these students as anti-Semitic. The questioner writes, the United Nations reports the discovery of mass graves at hospitals in Gaza, with some of the people in the graves handcuffed and buried alive. Is it anti-Semitic to condemn Israel for this?
Obviously not. Obviously, the very notion of anti-Semitic or anti-Semitism is being instrumentalized to try to keep the narrative. I was talking with some colleagues referring to a very interesting article by Kathleen Johnston, who is an Australian journalist. She has a blog, and one of her articles was reprinted in Consortium News. And I think she made a very important observation by saying that the reason why the students are being attacked as anti-Semitic is because it is about the control of the narrative. The control of the narrative is the game, and the student protest threaten to upset this. And she quotes there, for example, I think a business manager of Palantir, Alex Karp, who in a video conference is saying that exactly that it is about the control of the narrative. And if that is broken, that the United States would not be in a position ever again to fight any war. And I think that is definitely something to think about, because the military-industrial complex in the United States, but also in Germany, for example, Rheinmetall, for example, I think they quadrupled their asset value. They had a 10% increase in production. I mean, unbelievable. And the profits are gigantic, because you always have irresponsible people who want to make a profit on the death of others. So I think the notion of anti-Semitism is definitely used in this situation, because if you cannot look at what is happening and be upset in the deepest of your heart, you lost all humanity. Like I would say, this Lindsey Graham, senator, look at what he said. He said, the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki with nuclear weapons was absolutely the right thing to do. And in the same way, the Israelis have the right to do whatever they have to do. I mean, is this still human, or is this some distorted mind? That's even very polite for me to call it this way. But, this is insane. This is absolutely beyond the beyond. And that is being, not, did I hear from any of the mass media an outcry about such a statement like that from Lindsey Graham? So I think, Lindsey Graham is probably the biggest anti-Semite, because such statements will help to lead to the destruction of Israel. And he's not doing Israel one bit of a favor in having such words.
Okay, here's a question that just came in. Can the neoliberal banking system and neocolonial monopolism reform itself, or will it have to be forced to do so?
Well, I'm not so sure that they can reform themselves because, we were campaigning for the reintroduction of the Glass-Steagall banking separation law actually repeatedly. And the last time we did an earnest campaign, this was several years ago, I think in the aftermath or around the 2008 crisis and even after that. And then you had CEOs of the top banks flying around the country in the United States, putting pressure on state legislators, trying to absolutely convince them to not touch this, and they would have the most severe consequences if they would. So I'm not sure. I think that the power elite, which makes their profit based on speculation in derivatives and who have helped to accumulate this unbelievable indebtedness by having this speculative system, I don't think they will give up and be reasonable. I can see it. I always give people the credit of doubt and think even the last human being should, find a way to become human again if they are on a different course. But I think it will probably take a shock. I think that we should, be prepared to go in the direction of the four laws of Lynn and LaRouche. I think it would be very good if people would discuss that with their elected officials on all levels, Congress, Senate, state legislators, because I think that the moment of shock will come more quickly than people think. I think we are sitting on a complete powder keg of a system which is completely overstretched. The increase of debt cannot be paid. The outstanding derivative contracts cannot be saved. So I think it does require either a mobilization of the population. I know that we have independent candidates like Diane Sea and Jose Vega, where the four laws of LaRouche are in their election program. Around the rest of the world, I think there are massive efforts to create a de-dollarized system, to have trade in the national currencies, to eventually create another reserve currency. But that is not an easy process, and the transition does create a vulnerability. But I think the idea to plan for such a reorganization is of the utmost importance.
Now, I have a couple more questions for you, Helga. I'm going to put two together. Someone wrote in about the demonstrations going on in Georgia right now that are on a former Soviet republic, and that looks very suspicious. The person writes and says, it looks like a new Maidan-style regime change coup operation underway. Can we expect more of these things? And then I just got a note that there was an assassination attempt against the Prime Minister of Slovakia, Fico, who was shot. His condition is not known, but the person writes and says, this looks like the kind of operation that would be a destabilization. Any thoughts?
Well, the reasons, the motives of the terrorist who shot 3 or 4 times at Fico are not yet known. Fortunately, he seems to be not in fatal conditions. He's being treated in the hospital right now. But I think whatever will come out of this investigation, we have seen in the history what the so-called lone assassins were. They were almost never lone assassins. So we have to wait for what happens. But I think we are in a period of incredible danger, because I expect that the next several months will mean a complete change in the strategic situation. And, obviously wet work, obviously, the kind of Maidan efforts, like I think it goes in this direction in Georgia, because the Georgian government wants to make legislation which forbids foreign-financed NGOs to operate. And we have seen in Ukraine that, as Victoria Nuland had bragged, the State Department had spent at least $5 billion on these NGOs. And, now there is an obvious effort to rewrite the history, that this was a democratic change in the government in Ukraine, which it was not. Because there was the Orange Revolution in 2004, then, the issues were very clear, and we covered it all on the spot. So you cannot convince us to rewrite history when we were witnessing and reporting about it on the scene as it occurred. So I think we should really everybody should be extremely mindful and on guard, because, as I said, I expect the world to look completely different by the end of this year.
Well, we have another question that just came in that I think is interesting. Theo writes, "It seems to me that the lawfare and legal persecution of President Trump by the Biden administration is similar to the state attack on Lyndon LaRouche. Is this so?" And then he asks, "How can we hold the history of this persecution up so that the state will not be free to do this in the future to contrarian leaders?"
Well, I would not say that the situation is quite comparable, because my husband did not do any of the things he was accused of. Now, I don't know the validity of the accusations against Trump. What is clear is that whatever, the substance of it is being used out of proportion. I don't know if Mr. Trump had something with Miss Daniels, and I don't even want to know, but that is not exactly comparable to what Lyndon LaRouche was accused of, which was a complete travesty. The Ramsey Clark, who was the former Attorney General in the Johnson administration, he said that the case against my husband was the biggest bending of justice, the biggest travesty of justice in the history of the United States. Now, given the fact that this was done to a president, namely President Trump, I would say this is indeed on a similar level, and the methods are used the same. I can only say, if President Trump would have had the courage to open all the documents of Russiagate, which he could have done when he was still president, this problem could have been eliminated. I think this was definitely a big problem. And, he could have also exonerated my husband at the end of his presidency when he was exonerating several other people. And he would have done himself a great favor in doing so. So I can only say I have, mixed feelings about this whole thing, even so, it is the same apparatus. And it is what Bonhoeffer said, in terms of the Nazis, when they first came for the gypsies, then they came for the Social Democrats, then they came for the Jews, and when they came for me, there was nobody left to defend me. I think that message definitely applies to the situation.
Okay, and I have one final question for you, Helga, from Bob, who says, "I've learned a lot from listening to you, but here's a question for you. Is there a military-industrial complex or so-called deep state players in China and Russia who work with Western globalists?"
No, I think this is one of these fake stories being circulated to confuse people. Obviously you have sometimes an agent here and there, and they're being discovered and kicked out. But, I think China is a highly centralized country, which is one of the reasons for their efficiency. I think in Russia, I would say that after the, basically the death of Prigozhin, and the death of Navalny, there is no significant opposition. I think the country has moved in a different direction. They are turning towards Asia, to the disadvantage of the West. This is the own doing of the West to really stupid. But Russia is equally, becoming quite coherent, and I totally exclude the possibility of any connection to the military-industrial complex. I mean, there were efforts to divide Russia and China. Blinken, tried his best to accomplish that when he was in China. There were other developments where the Russians were told to disengage from China. They would have all kinds of advantages if they would. They flatly refused. So I think that I would definitely say no to your question.
Well, I hope that clarifies it for all the people who fall prey to this kind of disinformation. So, Helga, that's what we have time for today. Thank you for joining us, and I hope to see you again next week.
Yes, and please help us to distribute the Oasis videos to all people whom it may concern, people in the Middle East, legislators, elected officials, everywhere where you are. And let's try to build a constituency for a new security and development architecture in the tradition of the Westphalian peace, which takes into account the interest of every single country on the planet. And then we can overcome this war danger and establish a peace order.